Well, as a young man, I was a member of the Irish Military History Society for 25 years. And in 1966, which was the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Dublin Rising, Colonel Hally of the Irish Defence Forces wrote a two-part article on the Easter Rising in Dublin, some military aspects. Now, 10 years later, or actually it was 50 years later, come to think of it. 50 years later, I gave the talk again at the Irish American, and it was considerably added to because, of course, for the centennial, there was a veritable flood of books, articles, etc. However, I want to point out one thing. Most of them tell you what happened in Dublin. There's a lot of the political. I want to tell you about the military aspects and get you thinking about how this impinges upon our military situation today. This was, after all, an insurrection. January 6th, this year, we were supposed to have had an insurrection, a paltry thing. But nonetheless, I think you're going to find some things of interest because, for one thing, I've gone beyond Dublin to tell what else was happening in Ireland and in Great Britain, something that Irish historians seldom do. So here we are, Castle Yard. Because it was a lovely, fine spring morning at Dublin Castle, the headquarters of British civil administration in Ireland. And it was empty. At exactly 12, midday shots were fired. The Dublin Metropolitan Police Guard was shot dead at the upper Castle Yard gate, and the guard room was captured by less than a dozen Irish citizen army men in dark green uniforms. Rising had started. The first shots had been fired. The insurrection was on. The first victim was Constable James O'Brien, unarmed and an Irishman. Also at noon, or actually 12:35, I read my notes this afternoon, on the steps of the General Post Office on Dublin's main thoroughfare, Patrick Pearse read a proclamation to the small crowd which had gathered. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. It's interesting to me that the insurgents appealed to women as well as men, because in neither the United Kingdom nor in the United States did women have the right to vote. What was going on there? The third Home Rule Bill for Ireland passed in September of 1914. September. World War I began in August. Not unnaturally, the implication of this implementation of this bill, which promised a fundamental political change in the British Isles, was put on hold until after the war with Germany was ended, probably around Christmas time. Fundamental change. Well, for one thing, the largely Scotch-Irish and Protestant Ulster was opposed to this change. They feared that home rule was Rome rule. And Ulster Unionists gathered 500,000 signatures on a solemn covenant which pledged armed opposition to any home rule from Dublin. And with 30,000 rifles and at least one motor machine gun, the Ulster volunteers were very much in earnest. Now, to counter this Ulster threat of armed force, the Catholic South formed their own armed body, the Irish Volunteers, to defend home rule, and if and when it was instituted, they began training and sought a source of arms. Why couldn't the British Army enforce home rule? Because much of the officer corps of the peacetime British Army was drawn from the upper middle classes of Ulster Unionist and Anglo-Irish landowners. A mutiny among many of the officers at the Curator, Ireland's major army camp, ended only with the outbreak of World War I. Late in July of 1914, 1,500 antiquated single-shot black powder rifles arrived at Hooth just before the war. Black powder. They were transported from Germany aboard the Asgard, a pleasure yacht owned by Erskine Childers, a popular novelist. And there, the Fianna, the Irish Boy Scouts, and other nationalist Irish transported the rifles to hiding places, fighting off the Dublin police and the detachment of the King's Own Scottish borderers while on the way. The Irish Volunteers awaited 2 million rounds of ammunition and 20,000 modern rifles from Germany. But the shipment came to grief when the transport ship was stopped by the Royal Navy. The German captain later scuttled her cargo to deny it to the British. Meanwhile, the organizer of the effort, Sir Roger Casemate, was put ashore in Kerry, far from Dublin, from the German submarine U-19. Ill with malaria, he was promptly found in a field and arrested by the police. The Irish Volunteers intended to test their ability to mobilize and parade, taking advantage of the 3 days over the Easter holiday. But when Owen McNeill, commander of the Irish Volunteers, learned that the shipment of weapons from Germany had been foiled and that the British knew of a planned uprising that Easter, he angrily canceled the test. Working secretly in the background was a small group of 7 revolutionaries in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. This was a secret radical group dedicated to the violent establishment of an Irish republic. These men had infiltrated the high command of the Volunteers, and they had planned all along for an uprising during Britain's difficulties in the First World War. O'Neill was pushed aside. The cancellation order was itself canceled. Just 7 men. Is there any military lesson in this? Gun control is wonderful if you control the guns. A lack of weapons did not prevent violence, but it did mean that the rising could be no more than a token protest. Moderate leaders of political movements having a military arm can easily be pushed aside once the few ambitious and determined radical members decide to do so. The British planned to arrest the Irish volunteer leadership on the Tuesday after Easter. In military affairs, timing is every bit as important as terrain or training. Actually, most of the British garrison, which was off duty that Easter Monday, was at the races at Ferrymount Park. Great time to hold an insurrection. And the Irish Volunteers had about 3,000 members in Dublin, but only 1,000 got the order to mobilize, believed it, acted on it. So the old military slogan is order, counter-order, disorder. While Patrick Pearce and others raised the flag of the Republic over their headquarters in the General Post Office, 6 men of the Irish Citizen Army killed Constable O'Brien and captured the gate of Dublin Castle and went no further. Why bother to attack it at all? Perhaps it was better to leave the castle wondering what on earth had gotten into people that they were getting all of these panicky reports of a rising. It may have taken hours for the government to respond without the stimulus of these few early shots fired. And believe me, it was a stimulus. The chief British civil administrator in Ireland himself closed one of the gates of Dublin Castle against the insurgents. Afterwards, when volunteer leaders learned of the small number of men holding the castle, they were astonished. The failure to capture that castle that morning was the single greatest lost opportunity of the entire rising. And how did they learn this? Insurgent prisoners at Llangach internment camp in Wales, the future leaders of the War of Independence against Great Britain, enjoyed a college-level course on what had gone wrong and what should be done for success in the future. Michael Collins learned these lessons well. Accurate intelligence was one of the 2 keystones of his successful war against Britain, the other being terror. I wonder if such similar training is happening today among Guantanamo internees. Who were the enemy? The Irish volunteers were committed Irish nationalists, poorly armed, but under-disciplined and well-drilled. They told about 3,000 men in Dublin, 18,000 nationwide. They had training of a Boy Scout nature, drill, first aid, physical training. But they lacked medical, commissary, and signals support. To mention lacking machine guns and artillery. The Irish Citizen Army was a well-drilled and armed force of about 200 to 400 men and women. They were formed after the Great Transit Strike of 1913 for the purpose of protecting striking workers against the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Kind of like January 6th, isn't it? Their headquarters was Liberty Hall, the home of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Their leader, James Connolly, said to them, "The odds against us are 1,000 to 1, but if we should win, hold on to your rifles, because the volunteers may have a different goal. Remember, we are not only for political liberty, but for economic liberty as well. So hold on to your rifles." Interesting to me that many of these committed insurgents were more socialist than nationalist. And it would be wrong to say that they were all dedicated Catholics. That was not the case, although the great preponderance were Catholic. There were about 60 Irish Americans returned for the rising, serving with them. Some have come from a land across the sea. The Irish Women's Council was absorbed into the Irish Republican Army when the rising began. Their contributions were much more than simply token window dressing for feminism. Most served in traditional roles, nursing and feeding, but they could move around the city unsuspected and became an important source of intelligence and for transporting ammunition and weapons. Think baby prams. When a party neared the telephone exchange on the first day of the rising, they did in fact capture it, but were unable to disable the switching. It was a major failing of the Irish ability to carry out this insurgency. But it did mean that women messengers were very important. And the value of such women was not lost upon the Irish, because during the Civil War, Irish against Irish, 4 to 5 times as many women were jailed by the Irish government as the British ever did. Who were the enemy? Britain's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. By 1916, Britain's 1914 professional army was gone. The recruits of 1914 had been more or less adequately trained and were now more or less adequately equipped and supplied. They were entrenched. A proportion of that British army was Irish. Pre-war Irish volunteers were encouraged by John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, to join to fight German militarism and to protect small nations. About 180,000 Irish had heeded the call to join the colors. There were 3 Irish divisions fighting for king and country, and about 50,000 Irish died in the Great War. Despite the large number of British soldiers in France, and indeed the rest of the globe, there were still plenty of recent recruits training in Britain and Ireland. What was the terrain? The most important single terrain feature was the riverless Liffey tidal divided the city into south, north. Over here to see better. Okay, Liberty Hall, the General Post Office, that's the headquarters of the rebellion. The 4 courts, the legal portion of the British government in Ireland. Down here, we have the let's see, City Hall is the Dublin Castle, Jacob's Biscuit Factory held by the insurgents. I can't see anything else. Up here is Phoenix Park. I'm told it's the largest in Europe. There's the Viceregal Lodge, and down here is the magazine fort, which was the main storage for weapons of the garrison and ammunition and explosives. Once again, the Liffey divides the north and the south. The red is British assets. Okay, the headquarters, the 4 courts. Down here, Stephen's Green, held by the Irish Citizen Army, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, Boland's Bakery, the South Dublin Union, and the Alamo of the Rising. And up here, it's not on this map, the Mendacity Institute, another charitable foundation with 18th century buildings very strongly built. Most important of all, troops from Kingston. This is where the garrison, or rather the reinforcements from England would arrive from the Kingston ferry march into town. Also off the matter is the Amiens Railroad Station And it was from here that reinforcements from Belfast and the north, Ulster, would enter into Dublin. And over here on the left, along the Liffey banks, was the main railroad from the Curator and the rest of Ireland. So this is where the immediate reinforcements would come, into Kingsbridge and Amiens from the north. Personally, I think the insurgents would have been better off to concentrate entirely south of the Liffey's broad moat and hold the area within the Grand Canal with Trinity College as the headquarters, or Dublin Castle had they had the imagination to catch. But nonetheless, they did not. They purposely chose to spread their assets over too wide an area, and most damningly, these positions which they adopted were too far apart for mutual support. That's going to become very important because of another mistake that they make later. The immediate objectives. First line troops in Dublin numbered about 2,400 men. Ireland also had the Royal Irish Constabulary, a nationwide police force armed with carbines and trained for a counter-insurgency role. The Dublin municipal police were initially unarmed, and after 3 of them, unarmed, were shot and killed, the police commissioner took them off the streets, which made it a holiday for looters, which was another problem that both sides had to contend with. By 12:30 on Easter Monday, just 30 minutes after the first shots were fired, a telephone message from Dublin Castle had been sent to the main British Army base in Ireland, the Curator, about 30 miles southwest of Dublin and on the direct rail line into that city. 1,600 men of the Reserve Cavalry Brigade arrived at Kingsbridge Station at 4:45 Monday evening from Belfast in Dublin. Also arriving were 1,000 reinforcements from Belfast. So that evening there were 4,000 troops in Dublin versus about 1,000 insurgents, 4 to 1. Also on Monday afternoon, the 59th Midlands Division in England was alerted to send 2 brigades of infantry to Ireland. The 3rd Reserve Cavalry Brigade at Curator was alerted to be ready to repel a German invasion. Most Irish histories of the Rising tell you what happened in Dublin, seldom go beyond what happened elsewhere. The German raid on Ireland was a persistent worry of the British command and hampered their ability to take some steps which they otherwise would have. Furthermore, and I've only once seen this mentioned in Irish sources, most Irish histories likewise neglect to mention the Imperial German Navy raid on Britain's east coast ports of Lowestoft and Yarmouth. 8 battle cruisers and 7 Zeppelin airships within 130 miles of London, and happening by choice at exactly the same time as the Rising. I expect that this is where the attention of the British government was focused, not on the second city of the empire, but on the London capital. Monday afternoon, a patrol of mounted lancers was ambushed near the general post office, killing 4. Cavalry charge down the main street might seem to us to be the height of Olympism and thinking military mind at work. But 5 years before, in St. Petersburg, a Cossack charge had cleared the streets on Bloody Sunday. But of course, the peaceful Russian men, women, and children were unarmed. The British should have done more reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is one of the major tasks of cavalry. The British made 2 attacks on Monday. 3rd Regiment, Royal Irish Regiment, attacked the South Dublin Union along Mount Brown Street. Mount Brown Street. Richmond Barracks. There's the railroad station. They captured the gate after 2 hours, and this was sufficient to achieve their goal to pass troops from the Curator and west of Ireland into the city. Obviously, fighting in a built-up area has its own specialized problems. The 10th Royal Dublin Fusiliers attacked D Company of the 3rd Battalion of Volunteers under Sean Houston in the nearby Mendacity Institute as early as 1 p.m. Monday afternoon. It's less than an hour, and the British are responding. Some things they're doing very well indeed. 300 to 400 men attacked Houston's 30 men and were repulsed. Houston held out at the Mendacity Institute until Tuesday night. At nightfall, most insurgent positions were dug in or fortified. And while the rising was an aggressive act on the part of the insurgents, the tactics they used were almost entirely defensive. Seldom win on the defensive, unless you're really involved in strong buildings and have plenty of ammunition, which incidentally the insurgents got someplace, but they didn't get was food. Some of these men are going to go 4 or 5 days without getting any significant nourishment, let alone sleep. By Tuesday, plainclothes police had circulated freely. Dublin Castle knew that GPO was the headquarters. British troops could now bypass most of the outlying insurgent positions to attack it. The insurgents, on the other hand, were encouraged that Monday's clashes had been repulsed. They had expected to be soon overwhelmed, but the first planned defensive action by the British was on Tuesday. The British took the initiative and held it to the end. Early Tuesday morning, the Shelburne Hotel, Dublin's finest, was occupied by 100 British troops, including machine guns. Commandant Mallon's Citizen Army troops had dug trenches on the lawns of St. Stephen's Green, a park, which was just across the street from the Shelburne. At dawn, they were surprised by plunging fire from the roof of the Shelburne. Having neglected to occupy the high ground, in this case the roof of the hotel, the Citizen Army was driven from the trenches by 7 a.m. Meanwhile, north of the Liffey, the 1st Battalion had captured the Linen Hall Barracks, but they felt that they could not hold it. They set fire to it, which fire spread, and the flames and smoke made the defense of that area that much more difficult for them. Two things. Was it wise to attack the barracks if they could not hold it? And secondly, fire is seldom a benefit to the defensive. For one thing, the smoke allows the enemy to get too close. Also on Tuesday, Commandant Ash's 5th Battalion outside the city failed to destroy the railroad line to Belfast, north of the city. As this was undefended, this should have been easy. Tuesday also saw martial law declared for all Ireland. It was this legal status which permitted execution of the leaders after their surrender as allies of the German enemy in time of war. After Tuesday, with one exception, none of the big buildings south of the Liffey was attacked by the British with the intention of capture. So far, all of the British troops engaged were Irish. By daybreak of Wednesday, the 26th, there were 6,600 British troops in Dublin. Wednesday morning, the real battle began. His Majesty's yacht Helga steamed up the Liffey from the harbor and commenced shelling Liberty Hall and the General Post Office area. Liberty Hall was unoccupied. Helga did not have much effect on the battle. Machine gun fire from the roofs across the Liffey pinned the surrounded insurgents within their fortress at the General Post Office, vainly awaiting the British bayonet charge that Pierce and Connolly kept expecting. Improvised armored cars were used to good effect by the British to cover the movement of troops into close range. This was perhaps the first use in modern history of an armored personnel carrier. As a war gamer playing battles with my tiny soldiers, I was amused to note that a German company has recently offered for sale a small plastic replica of this vehicle. We fight the rising in Dublin. The volunteer battalions were now cut off from their headquarters. The three south of the Liffey, 2nd, 3rd, and the Citizen Army, were little engaged for the rest of the battle and suffered comparatively few casualties. Reinforcements from Britain had arrived and advanced into the city in 2 columns. The 5th and 6th Sherwood Foresters pushed on to the west of the insurgent-held areas of the city, marched to the west and arrived here in Kilmainham without opposition. 7th and 8th Battalions pushed on directly from Ballsbridge to the Grand Canal, to Mount Street, where they had to force a crossing of the canal. Here occurred the Thermopylae of the battle. Grand Canal, and here is the road Northumberland coming up from the ferry, and here is a place called Clan Williams. And the British want to get ashore here and march further into the center of Dublin. Shortly after noon on Wednesday, the British column of 4s, imagine marching down the city street in a column of 4s during an insurrection. Well, they came to 3 substantial buildings and Lieutenant Michael Malone of the 3rd Irish Volunteer Battalion won undying fame in his native Ireland for the accurate shooting and determined fight at this post. The British Lieutenant Colonel commanding the foresters telephoned Dublin Castle to ask if it was really necessary to continue to try to capture Clan William. He was told by General Lowe, the British commander, that it was. Further attacks were made with more casualties. Had this column gone 2 blocks down, could have crossed unopposed. Well, what does this mean? This is an army that is still training. This is an army which is at least learned to obey orders. The fact that the commander, General Lowe, did not know what the situation was didn't matter. He wanted his troops to show aggression. And that's just what they did. For 9 hours, Malone and his 13 men in 3 buildings held out until low on ammunition. Opposed by almost 1,000 men, Malone showed what might have happened with a more realistic plan and a better deployment in this built-up area of sturdy brick houses. The British lost 4 officers killed, 14 wounded, and 220 other ranks killed and wounded. Of Malone's men, 4 died, including Malone. 4 were captured, 3 escaped. 13 men, 240 casualties, enemy casualties, a 9-hour delay. Poor boys, said a contemporary observer, many of them had never shot anything but a blank cartridge before. None had been trained for street fighting. Their exercises had been in marching, entrenching, bombing, bayonet practice, field engineering. They had at first no grenades, and at no stage had they a field gun. The direction was courageous but unimaginative. All ranks go forward and kill or be killed. Colonel Hally surmises that the Irish volunteers were probably better trained than the British Army. Meanwhile, north of the Liffey, low on food, ammunition, and sleep, Commandant Houston surrendered the Mendacity Institute this afternoon. While Malone's men gave a splendid example of good marksmanship at Mount Street Bridge, and Houston's men displayed their determination at the Mendacity Institute, the winner in both battles was the hand grenade, of which the insurgents had very few, if any. When fighting in a built-up area, if an enemy can get within throwing range, the grenade was the tool to capture buildings room by room. The British take the initiative. General Friend, British military commander in Ireland, returned from holiday in London and resumed command of the action. I can't imagine that being on holiday at the defining moment of his career did his efficiency report any good. Nevertheless, he was in a fortunate position. Fighting patrols had given the British a very good idea of where the insurgents were, how many there were, and their relative importance. And perhaps most importantly, a German raid now seemed unlikely. Friend decided to put a cordon around the GPO and by crushing it, crush the brains of the rebellion. Yes, such a loose organization in such widely dispersed locations could be said to have a brain. The cordon was accomplished by 5 p.m. Thursday. The British had 4 18-pounder guns. Here is Dublin Barracks on fire. I guess that's just a filler. I won't talk about it. Because I want to talk about the 18-pounder field guns. 4 of them. One of them at the Parnell Monument, which incidentally still bears the bullet holes in the decorations. They opened fire at the GPO at noon. But it was difficult to shoot along the street and get a satisfactory hit on the parallel facade of the GPO. Still, these guns made short work of street barricades and they could fire incendiary shells. Michael Connolly was very active, but this was his undoing as he was wounded twice. First in the left arm, and then afterwards, a bullet shattered his left ankle, causing great agony. This was a serious blow to insurgent morale, and I must think to deliberations inside the GPO. A fire started at Lower Abbey Street and burned everything southward to the river. Smoke and flames drove in insurgent outposts in other buildings around the GPO, further weakening the defense. And this was the mistake that the insurgents had made. They didn't have enough and strong enough outposts to keep the British from closing up to the large main positions. And the fire, of course, burning through here, drove the outpost back into the GPO where there were just that many more guys shooting out the window. Fire is usually the enemy of a planned defense. The rising was the greatest destruction of property in Dublin ever. 5 million pounds of damage, thousands made homeless, and eventually 100,000 forced to seek public assistance. Also on Thursday, the British attack on the South Dublin Union was renewed. Commandant Kent decided to consolidate his position, and the Irish withdrew from room to room through a maze of holes knocked in the sturdy walls. The last man out, Cahal Rua, was caught and wounded 5 times and alone held off the British for 2 hours in an adjacent yard with his pistol. When his comrades returned to remand the position, Rua was heard singing "God Save Ireland." He had been wounded 25 times. The struggle lasted until dusk, fought with pistols, rifles, and by the British with hand grenades. 2 1/2 companies of British infantry against 27 insurgents. In one sense, the great preponderance of British troops is irrelevant. One has to be impressed with the determination and bravery of many of the insurgents. Victorious, Eamon Kent and the 4th Battalion were not molested again, and they surrendered when ordered late on Sunday. Friday morning, Cahal Brewer was given to the British to receive medical care in the South Dublin Union Hospital. British, seeing he could not live, released him to civilian doctors. He lived, only to die from a Free State bullet in the later Civil War. Today, a Dublin Barracks is named for him. Lieutenant General John Maxwell arrived in Dublin's North Wall at 2 a.m. on Friday, armed with full authority to do whatever he thought necessary. He had about 16,000 troops. He made no changes to existing orders, which says to me that most decisions so far were militarily correct. The plan for Friday was to attack the Four Corners and the Liffey Quay, and also the GPO. The actual heavy fighting was a quarter-mile north of the Four Courts on North King Street. North King Street. Incidentally, this is one of the hardest things I had to do to prepare for this. It's hard to get a map of Dublin in 1916, and needless to say, a lot of the British names of the streets have changed. So it's one thing to know that they went to Gresham Street. It's another thing to try and find out where Gresham Street was. But anyway, here the British pushed into rebel positions. The two sides struggled for a 150-yard section of the thoroughfare. Sheer numbers eventually prevailed, but at a cost to the British of 14 killed plus 33 wounded. Advancing west along North King Street, it took 14 hours to advance 700 yards. 7 football fields, 14 hours. The distance gained was by tunneling through walls and by using the armored car. Here's the interior of the General Post Office, bullets flying all around. That is Connolly in the on the stretcher. I probably figured it out for yourself. Okay. Out of sequence here. Okay, that's where we ought to be. The 6th Battalion South Staffordshire Regiment, who fought here, had the second highest number of casualties of any British units. Because these newly raised troops lacked sufficient training and discipline, they took out their frustrations by murdering in cold blood 15 civilians sheltering in their own basements. General George S. Patton said, "There is only one kind of discipline, perfect discipline. Think of Abu Ghraib and the immense damage done to the United States fight in Iraq by half a dozen bored, semi-perverted jail guards on the night shift." Meantime, the fire on the GPO became so severe that the decision was made to evacuate all the women and wounded in the garrison. All were sent out under a white flag except Connolly, his female secretary, and 2 nurses. That afternoon, artillery fire set the roof on fire, and the insurgents could not put out the flames. By evening, the fire had burned down to the ground floor, and the garrison escaped by tunneling through walls of surrounding buildings. Reaching Moore Street, machine gun fire from across the Liffey, firing down the streets, prevented their crossing the streets and thus escaping. Friday, Commandant Ash's 5th Battalion, in a handsome action, defeated a column of Royal Irish Constabulary at Ashbourne, County Meath, and took them prisoner. By the time he was ordered by Pierce to surrender, Ash had captured over 100 carbines, but at this stage they were irrelevant. There were local risings in Galway, Donegal, and particularly in Cork, but always too little, too late. In court, it rose on Wednesday and went home. Imagine how the British task of subjugating would have been complicated if just a dozen local volunteer commanders had taken to the hills without orders, but with 24 men each. To hunt down these bands would have required thousands of British troops, and taking them weeks. At 12:45 p.m. Saturday, Nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell was asked to take a message to the British commander. She eventually was taken before Major General Lowe, and he ordered O'Farrell to be searched, as she might well have been a spy. Well, what was O'Farrell going to learn by spying at headquarters surrounded by British troops? Once again, let me remark on the prominent role played by women during the Rising, and indeed afterwards. At 2:30 p.m., O'Farrell and Pierce walked to British headquarters. The terms were simple: unconditional surrender. Pierce surrendered his sword to Lowe and was taken off to prison. Throughout the siege of the GPO, many civilians had been killed and wounded. Some were looters and others were fleeing from burning buildings. Pierce was affected by this, particularly after a family carrying a white flag was shot down as he watched. This made him the more eager to end the fighting. Husband, wife, and young daughter. The surrender order was brought to all outlying posts. Some of the troops' commanders refused to obey it because they knew that now Pierce was a prisoner of the enemy and thus incapable of giving an order. Elizabeth Farrell had to go around to the various volunteer outposts and persuade the men to surrender, follow the order. Patrick Pierce is the most notable Irishman in the Rising. Here is the wounded Connolly being taken off. He had to sign his own surrender order to be shown to the citizen army troops before they would obey. Consider the present war in Syria. Assad's government troops, supported by the Russians and the Turks, fighting against Syrian rebels, Kurdish separatists, the Iraqi forces in Syria, and the NATO coalition, formerly ISIS. It's going to take a big table to seat all of these delegations at the peace conference. But of course, there won't be a peace conference. The war will just peter out. But I thought it was very interesting that the citizens' army would not follow the surrender order of Patrick Pierce. The few insurgent positions which had not been heavily engaged were amazed and or dismayed by the order to surrender the still intact positions. In a few cases, the desire was to fight to the death, which of course was pointless. The Rising was Pierce's to plan and shape into the end result he wanted. But the man I admired is James Connolly, a pragmatist and a man of great charisma. He told a friend he knew his fellow socialists would blame him for fighting fellow working men in the British Army. But he told his wife, they forget that I am Irish. Save for sniping, there was no further action but some south side positions did not surrender until 3:45 p.m. on Sunday. As volunteers surrendered, they were marched off to Dublin's park to spend the night under guard until prisons could be got ready for them. Captain Lee Masters amused himself by identifying several of the prisoners and stripping them naked in the cold, keeping up a running commentary. I'm happy to say that Michael Collins arranged for his assassination a few years later during the War of Independence. So I am reminded of Lincoln's phrase, suppose you go to war, you cannot fight always. Wars end and retributions happen. And this is, I think, a very good reason for fighting a clean war. Touring in Italy, I learned that an estimated 50,000 fascisti were killed after Italy changed sides during World War II. The ceasefire meant men with a grudge and a gun could travel anywhere in the country. Despite the bullets flying, looters had visited fashionable shops along Sackville Street, even stealing pianos. Among the last positions to surrender were the 3rd Battalion at Boland's Bakery. And I have to think that this photograph of Eamon de Valera in captivity was easily worth 10,000 votes. Anytime this future Prime Minister of the Irish Free State and President of the Irish Republic ran for election. Time spent in a British prison is almost a prerequisite for many heads of state in the newly created nations of the 20th century. The rising was over. It has left us with a host of legacies. Take your pick and put your own spin on it. I'm always suspicious of historical numbers, but in all, 64 insurgents were killed, about another 120 wounded, 134 British killed, and 381 wounded. In addition, 220 civilians were killed and at least 660 wounded. A total of 179 buildings lay in ruins. This was a big deal. So that when I heard that there was an insurgency in Washington on January 6th, and that 6 people died, I laughed. Americans just were sheltered by the Atlantic and Pacific. We just don't get what the rest of the world is like. This ends the military aspects of the rising, but of course war is politics carried out by other means. What are some of the legacies flowing from this event, which of course was the inspiration for the wars of liberation following the end of World War II, when Britain was once again in dire straits? Well, eventually all the signatories to the proclamation of the Republic were shot, as well as all the battalion commanders except Commandant de Valera, an American citizen. The museum at Kilmainham Jail displays this pair of spectacles. They belong to Joseph Mary Plunkett, who was in the GPO and who was the number 3 man and the military expert, according to James Connell. Plunkett's glasses are a good and indeed poignant example of what the Catholic Church considers a second-class relic. That is, something that was handled by the saint. They were taken off by the officer who applied the bandage around his eyes and handed to the police who administered the last rites to him just before his execution about 4 in the morning on 4 May 1916. People go to Dublin and they go to Temple Bar. What a waste. The wounded James Connolly was shot sitting in a chair. Tim Pat Coogan, in his book 1916, written for the 50th anniversary, had the advantage of interviewing Nurse Connolly, Nora Connolly, who described in vivid detail her last visit with her father at Kilmainham jail. Also with Kathleen Clark, whom the British awoke with a lorry at the door to take her to see her husband in his cell, lit by the light of a single candle. If you can get it, read Tim Pat Coogan, 1916. But you've got to do it in ABE books by your own, because there is not a single copy in the Upper Hudson Library system. It is often said that the secrecy of the British court-martials, plus the 2 weeks of executions, kept these matters in the newspapers and thus in the public eye. Protests were made in Parliament and in the American newspapers. But I ask you, what else could the British have done? This was war. This was the Irish allied with the German Imperial government. This is 240 British soldiers killed. So John Maxwell wrote a memo for the British cabinet. In view of the gravity of the rebellion and its connection with the German intrigue and propaganda, and in view of the great loss of life and destruction of property resulting therefrom, the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Irish Command, has found it imperative to inflict the most severe sentences on the organizers of this detestable rising and the commanders who took an actual part in the actual fighting which occurred. It is to be hoped that these examples will be sufficient to act as a deterrent to intriguers and to bring home to them that murder of His Majesty's subjects or other acts calculated to imperil the safety of the realm would not be tolerated. Did the executions of a mere 16 men really cause a great change in the thinking of the Irish people? Well, this is Ireland. Poets, singers, and the well-remembered history of Ireland also played a role. Recruiting almost stopped. The once successful Irish parliamentary party was moribund, and the pro-republic Sinn Féin party swept the next general election in 1918. In 1917, poet and Lance Corporal Frances Ledwidge wrote, "I joined the British Army because she stood between Ireland and an enemy common to our civilization, and I would not have written say that she defended us while we did nothing but stay at home and do nothing but pass resolutions." Yet he also went on to say, "If someone were to tell me now that the Germans were coming in over our back wall, I wouldn't lift a finger to stop them. They could come." He was killed by a German shell later that year. Later, having refused to hand over the dead bodies of the Pierce brothers, General Maxwell wrote, "Irish sentimentality will turn these graves, into shrines to which annual processions, etc., will be made, which will cause constant irritation in this country." Maxwell certainly got that right. I will finish with a quote that I feel is very appropriate by Irish author and journalist Clinton O'Toole, page 66, The Lie of the Land. The founding of the modern Irish state, the 1916 Rising, is as much a religious as a political act and conceived by its leader, Patrick Pearse, as such. Its symbolic occurrence at Easter, its conscious imagery of blood sacrifice and redemption, was shaped by a specifically Catholic political consciousness that belied the secular Republican aims of many of the revolutionaries. If you don't agree with this, I urge you to read Patrick Pearse's final letter to his mother. How can a modern military contend against the irrationality of centuries of religion, be it Roman Catholicism or international socialism, millennia of ethnic prejudice, or the patriotic feelings of long suppressed minorities? The Six-Day Republic had a greater effect on Ireland's future than 30 years of agitation and parliamentary politics that preceded it. The lesson is clear. Violence can be successful. Thank you very much. Sorry about those slides being out of sequence. I went through this 3 times. Of course, I was hampered by the fact that my printer, knowing that I was under a deadline, decided to go. No problem. Thank you very much. And are there any questions?
So we just have one comment on Zoom from David Flood. He said there is an American connection in the key failure around the failure to seize the communications cables. Commandant Teddy Sheehan, who failed to turn out, was the brigade engineer in 1916, and he had been assigned to seize the central telephone exchange and to supervise blowing the north side rail bridges in order to secure the northern flank to the GPO and the forecourts. Sheehan left for the US immediately after the Rising and found help from Devoy and Larkin. He died in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1918 of what seems to have been the Spanish flu. Apparently, Neil Hogan and Vincent McMahon and Patrick Mahoney helped him to trace that person. And there was a third Dublin Metropolitan man, Constable Fritz, who was shot by the British Army. And they are saying, thank you, great presentation. So an interesting little American connection there. Does anyone in here have questions or comments for Bob?
Just very, very well done. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot.
It is, I think, a different slant on the Easter Rising. So I don't know how you're going to work this into your next cocktail party conversation. But, you'll be prepared, won't you?
I will.
Does anyone, if anyone else on Zoom has a chat conversation, just ask us, just chat. Might be easier. Michael. Yeah, it was kind of astounding how quickly it was over. Well, I suppose it wasn't astounding, but you know, all these little mistakes made at the start, and the military, not having secured a wider cordon. I think that was an interesting point that you raised. You know, there probably was no way for the military, for the militants, I mean, like the 1916 people themselves, to have actually won. I don't know what buildings they could have taken instead. Even if they had succeeded in taking Dublin Castle, it probably wouldn't have helped really, except to stymie communications maybe.
It was supposed to have 3,000 men.
And the 3,000 men would have helped, yeah.
The issue, I think, that's come up in the past is if they had taken Dublin Castle, would the British have reduced it to ruin?
Yeah.
Or, you know, would they have attempted to negotiate at that point rather than destroy
all the property,
the castle itself? But, you know, if right, you can hypothesize and wish all you want, but you know, they were already spread out way too far over too much acreage. And, you know, you mentioned, yes, it would be nice to have outposts, but what are you going to do? Put one man in an outpost?
Yeah. Yeah.
You obviously needed more men from Troy there, didn't you?
It would have made the world of difference.
But you know, I wonder, Bob, when we talked about this a little bit, like, did Padraig Pearse intend for them, not intend for them to fail, but like, did he know they were going to fail? And so he said, you know, the red earth of the whatever, the earth needs to be replenished by the wine of the battlefield. You know.
As he left Liberty Hall to go to the General Post Office, one of his friends asked Connolly, "Is there any chance?" And Connolly said, "Not a chance."
Yeah.
Yeah, Connolly knew.
Yeah. And the O'Reilly kind of said the same thing. You know, I've helped to wind the clock. I have to go and watch it strike, even though they knew it was a disaster. Yeah. But I suppose without it, 1919 wouldn't have happened, or 1918 election. You know,
Right.
it kind of did need to kick them out of their inertia and the whole Home Rule Party, and you know, maybe it was needed to kind of get them to the next level of desiring freedom.
At his court martial, where he was incidentally not represented by legal counsel, he pointed out to the officers that there is always a chance when brave, determined men fight for what they believe in. Well, you know, this is a happening which is just so pregnant with opportunities to create a national feeling, a desire to be part of this generation, et cetera, et cetera. What can I say?
Yeah.
Have you detected any evidence that anyone in the leadership thought they had a chance to win?
Well, the ordinary man in the ranks was going to march through Dublin, come home, have roast beef, a couple beers, and go to bed. The next thing you know, he's in the South Dublin Union shooting at 10 times his own number of. What did they think?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess my question is the people that led those poor fellows who thought they were going home to roast beef, did any of them think that they were doing something that could?
I don't know the answer to that. I cut out the line where Pearse surrenders his sword, and I wanted to ask him, what was Pearse thinking at the supreme moment of his life? Okay.
Bob, isn't it true before the first shot was fired, there were completely opposite points of view among the leadership of whether they should even begin or not?
That I don't know. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Obviously, the people who opposed the rising were not there. I mean, they were the 2,000 that didn't believe the order and didn't show up. So what they would have succeeded in doing had they been there, I don't know.
Yeah.
But De Valera, who was not much of a military man, held his own for the better part of that time, did he not, at the biscuit factory?
His position was probably the least attacked of all.
Yeah. He's I can't even De Valera. Oh, yeah.
It's funny how time has not spent with
I know. Yeah. And he was the only one that wouldn't allow women fight as well. Like all of the rest of them had women, you know, if you wanted to be a nurse, fine, or if you wanted to pick up a gun, fine. He refused all women into it. And I guess you said it was the safest place to be, actually, you know. Yeah. I think one of the things too, and what you made an interesting point about prisoners of war today. You know, this is certainly Michael Collins learns a lot, you know, at how this is run. He was the aide de camp to Plunkett, you know, so he's right there in the GPO. He's probably privy to some of the conversations. you know, and I think this teaches him a lot for the War of Independence, and that, not to mind that they're all housed together in Wales, you know, swapping stories and ideas, but he certainly seems to learn a lesson.
Richard Mulcahy
Mm.
was one of the men who could not disable the switches at the telephone exchange.
Mm.
He goes on to become the commander of the Irish Free State Army.
Yeah,
I mean, this was a college level course
yeah,
in insurrection.
I never tied that together.
yeah. And Cathal Brugha is Minister for Defence, but mortal enemy of Collins, really, you know, in the end. They're on opposite sides during the Civil War. Yeah. So it's an interesting crucible that they're in for this week, you know.
It is.
I said it's a crucible that these men are in for this week, you know, and those who survive it kind of learn from it and do things differently the next time.
But as I said, some of these men hadn't eaten much for 4 days.
Yeah.
On the other hand, some of them were holding out at a biscuit factory.
Yeah. And they're very young. I think we forget that too. You know, some of them are very young. Kant is in his 50s, you know, but everybody else.
Again, I took an extra 5 minutes, but Pierce and Connolly turned over command at the GPO to a Sean McLaughlin because they were just so tired.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, the fighting around the GPO went on day and night.
Yeah.
So after 4 days,
You're tired.
Yeah.
Breathing all of that smoke. And
Yeah.
dust
And it's dark, probably. Yeah.
They were
did
just
twice.
Yeah.
They knew they weren't making good decisions.
So the interesting thing, you mentioned Cathal Brugha, he is shot in the thigh coming out of either the Shelbourne Hotel or the Gresham Hotel. He's on O'Connell Street when he's shot in the Civil War and bleeds to death. Like they hit his femoral artery and he dies quite quickly, but it's around the corner from where he was injured the first time, you know, or the first 25 times. It's very sad. So that was great, Bob. Somebody else said fantastic to hear the military aspect of this, because we, you know, sometimes you hear kind of the poetry and the blood sacrifice, but you don't actually hear the minute by minute accounts, you know, and so I think that was interesting. The British seem to have kind of had it under control quite quickly, which is not surprising, you know, and yeah, thank you very much for doing it. I love the pictures. They're all great. So thank you everyone for coming out, and people on Zoom, thanks for putting up with the filming. Take care.